Hey, let me start with something that sounds completely wrong, and I mean like aggressively wrong. Your life events don't actually cause your negative emotions. Not directly. I know, right? Right now you're thinking, hang on, that can't be right. And because if you lose your job or someone betrays you, then, or a relationship collapses, of course you feel terrible. Like, how could you not? Something bad happens and you feel bad. End of story. And that seems obvious. It seems biological. It seems like physics. But what if that story is wrong? Not emotionally wrong, but mechanically wrong. Because once you look closely at how the brain actually works, something fascinating appears. The event isn't what drains your emotional battery. Your interpretation of the event does. And if that's true, then the entire map of emotional suffering changes. And in this video, I'm going to walk you through a framework that completely changed how I think about emotions. And it comes from the work of Dr. David Burns. The system is called TEAM-CBT, and it does something unusual. Instead of asking you to excavate your childhood for 10 years, it treats emotional suffering like a software problem. You diagnose it, you identify the faulty code, and then you rewrite it. And before we get there, we need to talk about something strange about the human brain. When we talk about physical problems, we expect precision, don't we? We fall off the ladder and your arm hurts. You go to hospital, they take an x-ray. The doctor points to the screen and says, hey, you see the fracture and the bright white line across the bone, and the problem is visible, binary. Something broke and we fix it. Strangely, that certainty is comforting and the brain loves clear mechanisms. But emotional pain, that world is completely different. And strangely, that certainty is comforting. The brain loves clear mechanisms. But emotional pain, that world is completely different. You wake up on a Tuesday afternoon and suddenly feel worthless or anxious or stuck in some mental rut that you can't climb out of. And there is no x-ray for that. So no glowing fracture, no doctor pointing to the screen, just fog. And that diagnostic fog is exactly why cognitive behavioural therapy is so powerful, because it asks a specific question. What thoughts create which emotions? And that's mechanics. Now, here's the idea that make people really feel uncomfortable. So let's say it slowly. Events in your life do not directly create your emotions. Your thoughts about those events do. And I know right now your brain is pushing back. You're thinking, okay, maybe for the small things, but not for the real problems. So let's test it. Imagine two people lose their jobs. It's the same company, the same day, same financial situation. And person A thinks this proves I'm incompetent. I'll never find another job. My life is falling apart. And what happens emotionally is like panic, depression, shame. Now imagine person B gets the exact same layoff notice, but their thought is different. They think, honestly, I hated this job. This actually might be the push I needed. This might be the freedom I'm looking for. The same event, same money in the bank account. And you're not reacting to the world. You're reacting to the story that your brain tells you about the world. And once you see that, you start asking a different question. Instead of, why is life making me miserable? You ask, what story am I telling myself about this moment? Now, to understand why this happens, we need to talk about how the brain processes information. And the easiest way to understand it is imagine your brain like a smartphone. So events in your life, traffic jams, emails, awkward conversations, or those are just push notifications. They're neural information hitting the screen. And you thought about the event. That's the app that opens. And the emotion that you feel, well, that's how much battery that the app drains. If you've got a buggy app running in the background, a harmless notification can crash the whole phone. And that's basically what emotional suffering is. Bad code running automatically. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Your brain evolved to survive predators, not awkward emails. And if our ancestors heard rustling in tall grass, they didn't sit there calculating probabilities. They ran. Fear flooded their system intentionally because hesitation meant death. We are the descendants of the anxious apes who ran away. That system kept us alive. But today, the rustle in the grass isn't a lion. It's an ambiguous email from your boss, a strange look from someone on the train. Your ancient brain reacts as if it was a predator, and suddenly you're flooded with anxiety about something that exists only in your interpretation. So if thoughts create emotions, the obvious question is, how do we catch those thoughts? Because they happen incredibly fast, milliseconds. Most of the time, we don't even realize that they're there. We just feel something. Suddenly we're anxious or sad or irritated, and it feels like emotion came out of nowhere, but it didn't. There was a thought, and the daily mood log is designed to catch it. Think of it as a diagnostic dashboard for your mind. Like instead of just saying, I feel terrible today, you break the experience down step by step. First, you write down the event, just the objective facts, no interpretation, no storytelling, just the data. For example, like I was stuck in traffic, my boss sent a short email, or my partner cancelled dinner plans. That's the push notification. Then comes the interesting part, like you identify the emotion that you're feeling and you rate it from 0 to 100, for example. It's not vaguely, precisely. Something fascinating happens when you start doing this and getting specific. Like you realize your emotions are not just a single feeling, they're mixtures, like cocktails. And you might think that you're just stressed, but when you slow down and look closely, you discover it's actually, say, 40% anxiety, 30% frustration, and 20% sadness and 10% embarrassment. That active measurement does something incredibly important. It forces your brain out of panic mode because the moment that you measure something, you step outside it and you become the observer, not the victim. But here's where the daily mood really becomes incredibly powerful. Like different emotions come from different thoughts. And once you understand that relationship, you can start reverse engineering your mind. Like it's almost like having a decoder ring. Let me show you what I mean. Let's talk about sadness. You're feeling sad, depressed, or blue. Underlying thought is almost the same. It's of loss. Your brain believes that something valuable has been lost, a relationship, an opportunity, a future you imagined. A relationship ends, and the thought might be, I've lost my partner. I've lost the life that we were supposed to have. And that thought creates sadness. The emotion is the shadow of the thought. Anxiety. Now, anxiety is different. Anxiety looks forward. Anxiety is your brain running from a threat prediction simulation. And the underlying thought is something like, something bad is about to happen and I won't be able to handle it. And your brain is fortune telling. It's projecting a catastrophe into the future. And you might think, I'm going to mess up this presentation. They're going to think that I'm incompetent. My career will collapse. And your body responds if that future disaster is already happening. The heart racing, the chest tightening, and adrenaline's flooding your system. And even though you're just sitting in the chair, anxiety is the brain preparing you for a threat that exists only in imagination. Guilt. Now, guilt is another category entirely. Like guilt comes from should statements. The underlying thought is, I broke a rule. I should not have done that. I should have done better. And maybe you snapped at your child. And the thought becomes, I shouldn't have done that. I should be a better parent. And that thought creates guilt, like you violated a rule, a personal rule. Shame. But shame goes a step further. Guilt says I did something bad. Shame says I am something bad. Instead of evaluating the action, you evaluate the entire self. I am a bad person. I am defective. And that thought produces shame. Inadequacy. There's another emotional cluster, feelings like inferiority or worthlessness, inadequate, defective, and these come from something called labeling. Your brain takes a single mistake and it turns it into an identity. You failed a test, and instead of thinking, I failed this test, the thought becomes, I am a failure, and you reduce your entire identity to the one moment. And finally, there's anger. Like anger almost comes from blame. The underlying thought is someone else is acting unfairly. They shouldn't be doing this. Maybe someone cut you off in traffic and the anger doesn't come from the car. It comes from the thought. That guy is a selfish idiot. He shouldn't be allowed to do that. And your brain perceives injustice and launches a retaliation response. Now here's the important insight. Like every emotional category points to a specific thinking pattern. Sadness is loss. Anxiety is future threat. Guilt, a broken rule. Shame is identity judgment. Anger, blame. And once you see this, something fascinating happens. Like you stop being confused by your emotions. And instead of thinking, why do I feel this way? You start asking, what thought created this? And I think that question changes everything, because once the thought is visible, it becomes something that you can challenge. But before we get there, there's an assumption that we need to confront. And it's a big one. Like most people believe that the goal of mental health is eliminating negative emotions, like no sadness, no anxiety, no guilt, just calm positivity all the time. And that's actually a misunderstanding, because some negative emotions are healthy and some are distortions. And learning to tell the difference is one of the most important psychological skills I think that you can develop. And this is where something surprising happens. Like when therapists start helping people challenging their negative emotions, people often resist. This is something they push back, which sounds strange, right? Why would anyone resist feeling better? But when you look closely, the reason becomes clear because sometimes our negative emotions feel important. They feel like they say something meaningful about who we are. Let me show you an example. Imagine you lose someone you love, like a partner, a parent, a close friend, and you're grieving, you're sad, you're devastated. Now imagine I had a magic button that said, well, if I was to press this button, and all of your sadness would disappear instantly, and you would feel nothing, like no grief, no pain, just calm neutrality. Would you press it? And most people say no immediately because it feels like a betrayal. Like your sadness represents something real. It reflects your capacity to love. Your grief is emotional proof that your relationship mattered. If you erase the sadness, you would erase the meaning of love. And this is what David Burns calls positive reframing. Sometimes negative emotions are not defects. They're reflections of your deepest values. But here's the crucial distinction. Healthy sadness says, I lost something important. Unhealthy despair says, I am worthless. Healthy grief honors the relationship, and distorted thinking attacks the self. And that's the difference that we can care about. We don't want to eliminate healthy emotion. We want to eliminate the distorted suffering. Pain is part of life, and suffering is created by faulty thinking, and that's optional. So now we understand something really important. Events trigger thoughts. Thoughts create emotions. And some emotions are healthy and some are distortions, which means the next question is obvious. Like, what exactly are the thinking errors that create distorted suffering? Because if we can identify those errors, then we can correct them. And that brings us to one of the most useful ideas, I think, in cognitive psychology, something called cognitive distortions. And these are predictable patterns of faulty thinking, mental shortcuts that your brain uses that accidentally warp reality. Once you learn them, you start seeing them everywhere. In yourself, in other people, in conversations, in arguments, on social media, and you can't unsee them. There are 10 major distortions. But instead of memorizing a list, it helps to see how they cluster together because most of them fall into a few predictable traps. The first group I'm going to call binary thinking traps. Like your brain loves simple categories, good or bad, success or failure, win or lose. But real life doesn't work that way. First distortion in this category is called all or nothing thinking. It's when you evaluate situations with absolute black and white terms. No grey area, no spectrum, either everything perfect or everything is a disaster. And the problem with this distortion is that it creates impossible standards. Let me give you an example. There was a patient named Saul. Saul struggled with clinical depression and something interesting happened during treatment. After a really good therapy session, Saul would leave feeling incredible. He would think, I'm cured. This worked. I will never be depressed again. Total optimism, total certainty. But a week later, something small would go wrong, and maybe a stressful day at work, maybe an argument, and suddenly the thought flipped. This therapy is useless. I'm hopeless. I will be miserable forever. And he bounced between total victory and total failure based on a single moment. And that's the danger of all or nothing thinking. It can turn life into a roller coaster because reality is never perfect. So the crash always comes. The second distortion group is overgeneralization. This is where your brain takes one negative event and then turns it into a lifelong pattern. Like you fail one test and suddenly the thought becomes, I always mess things up. I never succeed. One rejection becomes, everyone rejects me. One mistake becomes, I ruin everything. And the brain takes a single drop of rain and decides the entire climate is a monsoon. The third distortion in this group is labeling. This is the one most damaging because it targets your identity. Instead of evaluating an action, you evaluate the entire self. You make like a mistake at work, and instead of thinking, I made a mistake, the thought becomes, I'm such an idiot. I'm a failure. And one moment becomes a permanent label. You reduce the complexity of a human being into a single flaw. And once that label sticks, like everything else disappears. Let's talk about some of the reality filters. Like the next cluster of distortions involves how we filter reality. Like your brain receives enormous amounts of information, but it doesn't process all of it equally. Some of the information gets magnified, other information gets ignored. And the first distortion here is called the mental filter. So imagine your brain is like a camera lens, and the mental filter zooms in on one negative detail and ignores everything else. You receive a performance review and 95% of it is praise, but your boss mentions like one improvement, and suddenly that single comment is all you see. The praise disappears and your brain fixates on the criticism, and your entire emotional reality becomes negative. So from an evolutionary standpoint, this makes sense. Our ancestors survived by noticing threats. The brain evolved to prioritize danger, but in modern life, that survival mechanism often misfires. Then there's even a stranger distortion, something called discounting the positive. This one goes a step further. Like instead of ignoring positive experiences, you actively reject them. Someone compliments your work and your brain says they're just being polite. That doesn't count. You got lucky. And your brain becomes hostile witness against your own success. Like good evidence is dismissed and negative evidence is accepted instantly, no matter how well you perform. And you just never feel good about it because your brain refuses to let positive experiences register. Then we encounter a distortion called magnification and minimization. This is sometimes described as the binocular trick. Imagine looking through binoculars and you look at your flaws and you look at everything in a magnifying end. Stakes appear enormous, catastrophic. And when you look at your strengths, you flip the binoculars around and your achievements shrink. Your abilities feel insignificant and your brain exaggerates weakness and it minimizes strengths. Let's talk about the projection errors. The next cluster involves something fascinating, like your brain is trying to act like a psychic, and the distortion is called jumping to conclusions. It comes in two flavors. The first is mind reading, and mind reading happens when you assume you know what other people are thinking without any evidence, and you send someone a message. 3 hours pass, there's no reply, and your brain instantly concludes, they're annoyed with me. I must have said something wrong, and they don't want to talk to me. But you have zero data, right? They might be in a meeting. They might be driving. Their phone might be dead. But your brain confidently invents a negative explanation. Humans are strangely arrogant about this. We assume that we can read minds, even though we can barely understand our own. The second form of this is jumping to conclusions, is fortune telling. This is predicting the future and assuming the worst possible outcome. You think, say, this presentation will be a disaster. I'm going to fail at this interview. This date is going to be awkward. And the brain projects a catastrophe into the future and treats it like a certainty, which is ironic because the prediction itself often creates the outcome. You enter a situation nervous, defensive, self-conscious, and the anxiety you predicted, well, it starts shaping the event. Now we reach the final cluster. Thanks for sticking with me. These distortions that enforce misery through rigid rules. The first is should statements. These are invisible rules to your brain and imposes on life. I should always be productive. I shouldn't make mistakes. I must always stay calm. I should never have negative feelings. And these rules sound motivating, but they're actually punishing because the moment that you violate them, guilt appears. You feel like you failed a moral test. And the problem multiplies when you apply those rules to other people. My co-workers should be more competent. The train shouldn't be late. My partner shouldn't behave like this. And reality refuses to follow your rules, and the result is frustration, anger, resentment. Then there's personalization and blame. This distortion points to two directions. Sometimes you blame yourself for events that are outside your control. A parent might blame themselves entirely when their teenager struggles at school, ignoring the teenager's own choices. Other times the blame goes outward. You blame co-workers, your boss, economy, circumstances. And when blame dominates your thinking, solutions just disappear because blame keeps attention on fault instead of change. And finally, the most deceptive distortion of all is emotional reasoning. And this is the belief that your feelings are reliable evidence. The logic sounds like this. I feel like an idiot, therefore I must be an idiot. I feel guilty, therefore I must have done something terrible. I'm afraid of flying, so therefore flying must be dangerous. And this distortion is powerful because the feelings are real and your heart is racing and your chest is tight and the emotion is real, but the conclusion isn't. Feelings are signals, not facts. And once you see these distortions, something fascinating happens. You start noticing them everywhere now, in your own thoughts, your arguments, conversations, even public discourse. And suddenly you realize something really important. Your brain is not a neutral observer of reality. It's an interpretation machine. And sometimes that machine produces faulty conclusions. Now, the good news on this is that once distortions become visible, they become editable. And this is where we finally arrive at the most practical tool in the entire framework, something called the triple column technique. The moment where you're going to realize that you can actually do something within this framework. So now we know something important. Our emotions are being generated by thoughts. Some of those thoughts are accurate and some of them are distorted. And the distortions follow predictable patterns, which means something remarkable. If we can identify the thought, we can challenge it. This brings us to the most practical tools in cognitive behavioural therapy, something called the triple column technique. This is the moment where theory becomes practice, because instead of just understanding distortions, you actually rewrite the thinking pattern that produced the emotion. Let me show you exactly how that works. Imagine a simple piece of paper divided into 3 columns. Column 1 is the automatic thought, column 2 is the distortion, and column 3 is the rational response. That's it, 3 columns. But inside those 3 columns, you've got something extremely powerful. You take the thought that was silently running your emotions and you bring it into the light. Let's walk through a real example. Imagine you're giving a big presentation at work, like high stakes. The executive team is in the room and you've prepared for weeks. Everything starts smoothly, then suddenly you lose your train of thought and you click the wrong slide. You stand there in an awkward silence. 10 seconds, and it feels like 10 minutes. Eventually you recover and you finish the presentation, but your brain, it's already spiraling. So you open the daily mood log. Step 1, the event. You write, I stumbled during the presentation. Just the facts, no storytelling. Step 2, you rate the emotion, embarrassment, anxiety, inadequacy, maybe even shame. And they feel intense, so you write embarrassment, 90%, anxiety, 85%. And your body still feels the stress. Your brain is replaying the moment over and over. Now comes the key step. Column 1, the automatic thought. You ask yourself, what exactly went through my mind? And you write something like, I completely ruined that meeting. Everyone thinks I'm incompetent. My reputation here is destroyed. And then you rate how strongly you believe in that thought. Maybe 95% because in the moment it feels completely true. Now column 2, the distortions. This is where we do the detective work. And you look at the list of the cognitive distortions and you ask, well, which of the thinking errors are operating here? Like immediately you see a few. Mental filter. You gave a 30-minute presentation. 29 minutes were strong, but your brain focused entirely on the 10 seconds. Number 2, fortune telling. You're predicting that your reputation is ruined, but you have no evidence of this. No one fired you, no one criticized you, and your brain is venting a full disaster. 3rd, all or nothing thinking. The rule is this, like if the presentation wasn't perfect, it was a failure. But real life doesn't work that way. Now comes column 3, the rational response. And this part is important. And it's not positive thinking. It's not affirmations. It's accurate thinking. You need to put a lie to the old thought. So you write something like this. Yes, I stumbled for a few seconds. That felt awkward. But the rest of the presentation was strong. The information was solid. Everyone loses their place sometimes. One moment does not erase years of competence. And you write it down. And then you look back at the original automatic thought. I completely ruined the meeting. And you ask yourself again, how strongly do I believe this now? Maybe it drops from 95% to 30%, maybe even lower. And here's the fascinating part, like when the belief drops, the emotions drop with it. And you go back and you re-rate them. Embarrassment drops from 90 to 30. Maybe anxiety drops from 85 to 25. Inadequacy drops from 80 to 15. And the relief is physical, like your shoulders relax, breathing slows, your nervous system settles because the brain stopped running a distorted program. When you do this process, you're not just calming yourself down, you're actually changing the structure of your brain. So every time you repeat a distorted thought, you strengthen that neural pathway. It becomes faster, more automatic, more convincing. But when you challenge a thought and replace it with a rational response, you weaken the old pathway and you strengthen a new one. And over time, the rational thought becomes automatic and the distorted one fades. It's like closing a buggy app on your phone. The battery drain stops immediately. Now, the triple column technique works so well, but there are several additional tools that make the process even easier. These tools are incredibly clever because they bypass the brain's defenses. Let's talk about the double standard technique. This is one of the most powerful methods and it's deceptively simple. Like you just ask yourself one question. What would I say to a friend? Like think about it. If your best friend made the exact same mistake that you made, would you tell him, you're incompetent, you're ruined, you ruined everything, you're a failure? Of course not. You would be compassionate, hopefully, reasonable, supportive. You might say, hey, that happens. You handled it well. Everyone slips sometimes. And the double standard technique forces you to apply that same fairness to yourself. Instead of being your harshest critic, you become your own rational defender. The semantic method. Another useful tool is called the semantic method. This one targets language that we use in our thoughts, like specifically the words should, must, have to. And these words sound motivating, but they create enormous psychological pressure. Like, for example, I should always be productive. I must never make mistakes. I have to be perfect. Like those statements are impossible. No human can meet them. So the semantic method replaces those rigid rules with preferences. Instead of saying, I should always be productive, you say, I would prefer to be productive today, but it's okay if I have a slower day. The language shift immediately reduces pressure. Your brain stops treating the rule as a moral law and starts treating it like a goal, the cost-benefit analysis. Now, sometimes we cling to a distorted thinking because it feels justified, especially when we're angry, resentful, or blaming someone else. In those moments, the cost-benefit analysis becomes really powerful. You ask yourself, what are the advantages of holding onto this belief? Maybe the advantage is feeling morally superior, feeling right, feeling validated. And then you list the costs. It comes with stress, anger, sleepless nights, damaged relationships, lost peace of mind. And when you see the math clearly, you realize something. Like holding onto the belief is incredibly expensive, and suddenly letting it go becomes just that little bit easier. And not because you forgive the other person, but because carrying the resentment is simply just too costly. The worst best average method. Finally, there's a method that dismantles labeling, and it's called the worst best average method. Imagine you label yourself as a bad parent because you lost your temper, and your brain immediately believes that label. But now you ask 3 questions like, what's the worst parent imaginable? Maybe someone abusive, neglectful, cruel. And then ask, what's the best parent imaginable? Like perfect patience, infinite wisdom, never making mistakes. And now ask the honest question, where do I actually fall on that spectrum? Almost everyone lands in the middle. A normal human being, doing their best, making occasional mistakes. So the label bad parent collapses because reality is more complex than just a label allows. We've given some examples, but when you start using these tools, something fascinating happens, like you stop being controlled by your thoughts, and instead you start examining them, testing them, editing them. And the real power of cognitive behavioural therapy is that it turns your mind into something that you can observe and adjust, not just something that controls you. Hey, there's another technique in this framework that I found personally powerful. It sounds strange when you first hear it, but it's called externalization of voices. Because most of the thoughts that make us miserable don't actually feel like thoughts. They feel like authority. They sound like a judge or a teacher or a critic sitting somewhere else above you. And when that voice speaks, then we tend to obey it. It says things like, you're not good enough. You ruined that. Everyone can see you're a fraud. You don't belong here. What are you doing here? The strange thing is, though, we rarely question it. We just accept the truth. One of the most effective techniques in TEAM-CBT is incredibly simple. You separate your voice from yourself. You give it a role and you literally let it speak out loud. You might say, okay, let's hear what the critic has to say. And then you say the thought, exactly as appears in your mind. You're incompetent. You embarrassed yourself. Everyone knows you're a fraud. And now something fascinating happens when you do this, especially in a role play. The thought stops being invisible and it becomes a character in the room. And the moment that it becomes a character, you can answer it. You can also challenge it and you can defend yourself. Instead of silently absorbing the attack, you start having a conversation with it. Once that happens, the power dynamic shifts because that voice suddenly has to defend its claims, and so often it can't. Feared fantasy. There's another technique that works even deeper. If you follow a similar idea, that it's the one of the most dramatic moments that you see in therapy sessions. Like it's called the feared fantasy technique. This technique does something counterintuitive. Like instead of calming your fears, you let them happen. You imagine the worst fear coming true, like completely, fully. So let's say your fear is, I'm going to humiliate myself in front of everyone. And in the feared fantasy, you don't soften that. You exaggerate it. You imagine the absolute catastrophe that you stumble, you forget your words, the audience laugh, people whisper, someone rolls their eyes, and your brain screams, this is the end. And then something remarkable happens because in the role play, someone else often plays the negative voice. They become the critic, and they say exactly what your brain has been saying behind the scenes. You see, you're a fraud. You embarrassed yourself. You should never have tried. Now imagine that moment, like you're hearing your own internal critic, and it's spoken out loud by someone else, and suddenly it sounds different. It sounds exaggerated, almost theatrical. And here comes the turning point. Like one of my favorite moments of all time in a David Burns session was because the patient is arguing with the critic backwards and forth, trying to defend themselves, offering self-acceptance, but trying to reason with the voice. And then Burns interrupts calmly. He says, look, and he says something devastatingly simple. He turns to the critic and he says, that might be true, but that's not why I feel anxious or depressed. And the room goes quiet. And the critic pushes back. Well, what do you mean? You're depressed because you failed. And then Burns says something that completely pops the bubble. He says, no, I'm depressed and I'm anxious because I've been listening to your bullshit. And in that moment, something snaps. Like it's a spell breaking. People in the room are stunned because what just happened is psychologically dramatic. For the first time someone spoke back to authority, it's the moment in the classroom where the student challenges the teacher. Everyone freezes and you expect punishment. Instead, nothing happens. And suddenly you realize something like the authority only existed because you believed it. Once you challenge it, it collapses and the negative voice has no comeback. It's exposed. Just a thought, not a law, not a judge, not a fact, just a thought. What makes this moment so powerful is people often feel something physically, like a relief, almost a euphoria, like escaping from a chokehold, like being pinned under something heavy and then suddenly getting free. And the remarkable thing is this, that shift can happen in seconds, not years, not months, seconds, because the change isn't happening in the world. It's happening in the interpretation. Once the authority of that voice collapses, the emotion collapses with it. And that's why practicing this really matters, because the more you do it, the more natural it becomes. You hear the critic, and instead of submitting to it, you answer back. And every time you do that, you weaken the old pathway and you strengthen a new one. And that moment when you realize that you can challenge your voice inside your head, it's often the moment that people feel truly free for the first time. Before we finish, there's one more idea that we need to explore, and it's a strange one. And it challenges something almost everyone believes about mental health. Because most people think that the goal is to build high self-esteem. What if that idea is actually part of the problem? Let's talk about the final shift. So now at this point, most people have a very natural reaction. They think, okay, I understand the mechanics. I can see how thoughts create emotions. I can see how I could challenge those thoughts too. But surely the goal is still the same. Like, surely the goal of mental health is to eliminate negative feelings, right? No anxiety, no sadness, no guilt, just calm positivity. But this is where something surprising appears. Because once you look closely, the goal actually doesn't make sense. Some negative emotions are not problems. They're signals, reflections of what matters to you. And if you remove them entirely, you would lose something very important. Let me give you an example. Imagine you lose someone that you love, like a partner, a parent, a close friend, and you feel grief, sadness, heartbreak. Now imagine if I had a magic button and I said, if you press this button, all of that sadness disappears instantly. You won't feel grief anymore. You'll feel completely neutral. Would you press it? And most people say no immediately because the sadness means something. It reflects the depth of the relationship, and your grief is proof that love existed. Like erasing the sadness would feel like erasing the meaning. And this is what David Burns talks about when something called positive reframing. Sometimes negative emotions aren't defects. They're expressions of your deepest values. Your sadness shows that you care. Your guilt shows that you have a conscience. Your anger reveals a violated boundary. The emotion itself isn't always the problem. The distortion behind it is. Look, think about it this way. Healthy sadness says, I lost something important. Unhealthy despair says, I am worthless. Healthy guilt says, I've made a mistake. Toxic shame says, I am the mistake. Healthy anxiety says, this situation matters. And disordered anxiety says, I'm doomed. And the difference is subtle, but incredibly important. Healthy emotions reflect reality, and distorted emotions reflect faulty thinking. So the goal of this framework is not to eliminate negative emotion. It's to eliminate distorted suffering. Like pain is part of life, but suffering is created by distorted thinking. That's optional. This leads us to one final idea, and it's a strange one, and it challenges something almost everyone believes about psychology. Like we're taught from childhood that mental health requires high self-esteem. You need to believe that you're valuable. You need to feel good about yourself. You need to build confidence. But there's a hidden trap inside that idea because the moment you start measuring your worth, you create a scoreboard. And scoreboards can go up or down. And if your self-esteem depends on success, what happens when you fail? If your self-esteem depends on intelligence, what happens when someone smarter comes along? If your self-esteem depends on performance, what happens when the circumstances change? Suddenly your entire identity becomes fragile because it's conditional. And this is where David Burns introduces something radical. The concept sometimes is called the death of the self. Not the death of your personality, not the death of your individuality, but the death of the idea of your worth that it needs to be measured. Because the moment you treat yourself like a report card, you create two possibilities, winner or loser, success or failure. But human beings are not report cards. You're not a grade. You're not a score. And you're not a performance metric. You are a living organism, having experiences. You're learning, you're failing, you're adapting, and you're growing. When you stop measuring, something surprising happens. Failure becomes less frightening because mistakes stop threatening your identity. They become information, feedback, part of learning. You step out of the scoreboard entirely, and once you step off the scoreboard, then a lot of the psychological pressure disappears. So, if you take one idea from this video, let it be this. You're not at the mercy of events in your life. You're not a passive victim of traffic jams or awkward conversations, bad meetings, critical emails. Those events are just notifications. What shapes your emotional experience is the story that your brain tells about those notifications. And when you start catching those stories, examining them, challenging them, something remarkable happens. You stop reacting automatically. You start responding consciously. You become the architect of your own emotional life instead of a prisoner in it. So here's a simple experiment. For the rest of today, just observe your mind. Notice the notifications, the awkward moment, the frustrating delay, the critical email, and pause and ask yourself one question. What thought just created that emotion? Write it down. Look for the distortions and challenge them, rewrite them, and see what happens. Because the moment you start doing that, then you're not just managing your mood, you're rewiring your brain. And that is where real psychological freedom begins. Thanks for listening. Chris out.